Guess I could ask. Yeah,
Cool. We come to our second speaker, who's William Smith, supervised by Stefan Pulver, if I'm not misled, and he will talk about doctoral students as carbon accountants calculating carbon costs of a PhD in neuroscience.
Cool. Great. So hi everyone, I'm a third-year PhD student in Stefan's lab. I'm going to talk to you about something slightly different to neuroscience and psychology. I'm going to talk to you about carbon accounting, i.e. estimating how much carbon dioxide emissions are produced from your lab, and try to convince you that this is something that maybe you should consider doing in your PhD as an appendix. So let's see how well that goes. Cool. So I want to start with that central question before I show you some of the data I've produced. So the first question is, I'm going to try and convince you why you should actually estimate your research carbon footprint. So the first question you might have, or first counter push you might have, is you might claim, decarbonization is already happening outside of academia, right? So you're seeing grid decarbonization, you're seeing industries and government implementing policies. Why do I need to get involved? Why do I need to do it? I have 4 reasons why you might need to. The first is, if you're hesitant about doing it, you're not the only person that's hesitant about doing it. People in your position in government, in industry, in other universities are also similarly hesitant. So if you are hesitant about doing something, it's therefore not a sufficient reason to think that somebody else isn't hesitant about doing it. The second is, even if you don't find that convincing and you think there are still people who are doing decarbonization efforts, two-sided decarbonization obviously therefore must be quicker. So if someone in a policy or university is implementing policies to decarbonize, if you do it as well, are you choosing when you do experiments, choosing to reduce the amount of carbon you're producing in your experiments, this presumably means you're going to decarbonize at a quicker rate. And hopefully I don't need to tell a university audience why climate change is a bad thing that we need to stop happening. The third thing is actually by trying to carbon account, so trying to estimate what your carbon footprint is, you don't just gain a lot of data that is quite interesting, but you actually start to gain a lot of awareness about the way in which your research practices are actually far more carbon intensive than you may initially think. It's also important that as soon as you gain awareness and maybe publish information about your carbon footprint, you gain a standing in the community. That means if you have ideas about decarbonization, you have a degree of legitimacy that underpins that type of policies. Because there are a lot of policies that are occurring, for instance, throughout Europe that are quite unequitable in the way in which they're pursuing decarbonization. So European policies are quite blanket of what type of decarbonization and pushing across Europe, which is causing a lot of pushback in places like Poland, Central and Eastern Europe, that is problematic for the European Union, for instance. So gaining awareness of ways how different areas can decarbonize, particularly within research, is actually quite important for making this whole thing work. The last is cognitive dissonance. So if you're hesitant and you think that it isn't actually that important, you'd be surprised by how important having a number behind how much carbon you're producing actually makes a massive difference. So I'm going to show you in here is how actually I've changed what I'm doing as a result of this research, specifically things like when I'm using the experiments, what time of the day, and how much I actually procure. And I have an estimate at the end of how much carbon I've actually saved as a result of just doing this research. The second question or second critique you might have is, this seems like it takes a lot of time. I'm doing a lot of things in my PhD already. Please give me a break. I would say a few things here. The first is it can be very time intensive. It was in certain instances for me, but we've unfortunately designed an app that significantly makes your life much easier than mine and other people's were. And I'm going to explain that towards the end of the presentation. Cool. So just I'm going to now show you some of the data I've produced based on carbon accounting. But first, I'm going to give you an overview of what actually, my main job as a PhD student. So I look at brain battles in these Drosophila melanogaster larvae. So basically, I'm looking at how different motor patterns are taking control of the motor system in different ways. And a part of that uses very expensive and somewhat energy demanding equipment. If you look at the life cycle of my research, so this is, what I do every day. The way research flies involve is you start with obviously producing loads of food. These are yeast-based foods in food generators. You want to do genetic crosses, which uses the word virgin collecting, which is just flies that have not yet bred, and you can therefore mix male and female flies in order to create new genetic combinations. One of the reasons why Drosophila are very useful. You prepare your experiment. This, for me, looks like dissections, various types of experimentation in the classic analysis pipeline, and then disposal. if you look at the amount of carbon dioxide that each instance of these produces, you have some numbers here that we'll go through. So if you look at the food generation, so this is just basically a mixer and a heater. This per month of using my research produces 152.4 grams of carbon dioxide. So every year times that by 12. I can't do that in my head. And that's the amount of carbon dioxide I produce just by the food that I'm using. And that's just like if I generated the food and then threw it away, that's the amount of carbon I'm producing statically. If you look at virgin collecting, so what is interesting about this is the way in which I sort flies is by direct anesthetization from carbon dioxide. So I literally have a pedal and a pad, and I literally release carbon dioxide into the air in order to anesthetize the flies to make it easier to select them. If I just do one vial, I end up releasing 1.6 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent every time I do that. Looking at different types of experimentations, there are 4 types of experiments I typically use. I use behavioral optogenetics. So this is where you have intact larvae. They express a protein within neurons that I'm interested in that I can manipulate based on light. Each experiment releases 0.4 grams of that for an hour period. Calcium imaging. This is where I take the central nervous system out of a larva, express calcium indicators in the neuron, and watch their activity pattern over an hour. Each prep of that is 0.8 grams. When it comes to dual color calcium imaging, so this is not just looking at one type of calcium indicator, 2 on top of each other. This is 2.2 grams per individual preparation. And then electrophysiology, where I'm actually recording the electrical activity from a motor neuron. This is 8.7 grams of carbon dioxide per experiment. So hopefully this information is interesting. In terms of analysis, every prep that I have to analyze based on my computer costs 1 gram of carbon dioxide, 2 grams of carbon dioxide per hour. And then in terms of disposal, these are things like autoclaves. This is a massive amount of 202 grams per month, basically, maximum. So that's a lot of numbers. What do those numbers mean in a year? So if I track, as I have done for a year, the amount of experimentation I have done, this is basically 1 year of my life as a PhD student in terms of carbon dioxide. Notice now it's kilograms rather than grams. So in total, this is 2.2 kilograms of carbon dioxide, which is an equivalency as a 12-minute hot shower or 35 tomatoes. You might be thinking, that seems a bit insignificant. In some ways, when I first did that number, I was like, oh, that seems like I haven't done a lot of work this year. But recognize that there's not just me as a PhD student. There is over 100,000 PhD students in the UK in 2020, 2021. So they are all doing the same amount of effort that I'm doing, hopefully. This is a massively hot shower, as in lots of time for a hot shower and the gas that it's producing. So that isn't actually as insignificant as you think. But even if you thought it was insignificant, hopefully I can just flip this argument and say if it's really insignificant, it must be really easy to mitigate and sequester that carbon dioxide rather than just forgetting about it and leaving it. If it is 35 tomatoes, maybe all PhD students have plant 35 tomatoes, and then you've mitigated your carbon dioxide load, which is quite useful. Rather than the fun of it, it's also important to recognize that society is quickly pushing pressure on academics to not just know what their carbon load is, but also to sequester that carbon load. So knowing how much carbon dioxide you are producing in your lab makes it easier to know how much you can sequester, and maybe it's makes it easier to make an argument why you should be funded rather than somebody else. When it comes to not just the life cycle of the science that I do, but also the lab itself, I looked at some of the values of the equipment that we're using. So in the lab, we have incubators for the flies, we have fridges, freezers, air conditioning, all of the standard things you'd expect in a Drosophila lab. That is the breakdown in terms of diversity. But so if we look at the carbon intensity per different time period, in a day, this is 59.2 grams. In a day, this is 1.42. In a week, this is nearly 10 kilograms. In a year, this is just the lab being as it is, even if you were never in it for a year, would produce 517 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent. To put this into perspective, this means if a researcher did nothing in this particular lab, you're using around just over half of the carbon dioxide emitted by a flight from New York City to London. So if you think about how many labs there are like this, we have some estimates of this. So we talked to there's a fly place in America that distributes a lot of flies called Bloomington, which gave us an estimate of how many active accounts there are, i.e. giving us an estimate of how many labs there are, around like 400 to 5,000, depending on the number of labs that exist. So if you times that number by potentially 5,000, you get a good indication of the amount of carbon dioxide a Drosophila lab en masse around the world are producing just from their persistent equipment. Quite a lot, basically. So a lot of this information might be interesting and useful. I think it's interesting. Hopefully you think it's interesting as well. But obviously we not just want to quantify it, we want to do something about it, right? We want to hopefully get rid of it rather than just consistently releasing it into the environment. So you might want to think about things called ex-ante mitigation, which is just how can we prevent it from happening in the first place? If you look at national grid-based measurements, what I can do, or what I have done, is if you take our lab and place it into different positions around the UK, how much equivalent carbon dioxide emissions would have been produced in those different regions. So you can see in Scotland it is 519. But if I moved our lab rather to the south of Wales, we'd be producing 10 times the amount, just the same lab with the same equipment, which is now in a different place. So this massive regional variation is an important finding in terms of where we fund science, for instance. But it raises an interesting question about equitability, i.e. if we cross over the map of deprivation within the UK over that map on the left, we can see that in particularly South Wales, areas that are significantly more deprived, unfortunately cross-apply to more carbon-intensive electricity grids, which is an interesting ethical question about if we want to fund science that is more green, how do we trade this off against things like funding less deprived areas of the UK, for instance? This is an important finding, and it is a useful finding, and it shows why this carbon accounting is quite useful in terms of the equitability of the discussion. There are two other ways in which you can think about ex-ante mitigation. The first is when you are doing an experiment. So if you look at the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent you would make per kilowatt hour at different times of the year, you can see it is not consistent. So if you were going to do very high energy research, very intensive research, perhaps doing it in months like December are far more preferable than doing it in months like June, in which you'd be producing 2 to 3 times the amount of carbon dioxide by doing the exact same experiment. It's quite surprising, I find, that December was lower, but this has to do with productivity problems, i.e. people go home in December, so things aren't used that much. As opposed to June, where it's quite warm, people use air conditioning, a lot of people are working. Interesting that that creates that disparity. Additionally, when you're doing experiments, you might want to think about the time of the day you're doing the experiment. i.e. if you take the same data and just bifurcate it into different time periods, if you did an experiment at 7 o'clock at night, if you're a night owl PhD student like myself, not very good in terms of carbon dioxide release per experiment you're doing. Perhaps doing experiments at different times of the day, like lunchtime, or depending how much of a night owl you are in the morning, could be helpful. So aside from direct experimentation, there's also other things as a PhD student I end up releasing carbon dioxide from. One is just travel. So a part of the PhD that I have involves moving around the United Kingdom and indeed going to conferences. If you look at the amount of carbon dioxide that I released by local travel in a year, this was 42, versus international travel, which was 380. So this means that just one PhD student doing the amount of travel required by their funding body released approximately nearly the same amount of carbon dioxide as the lab itself running for one entire year, which puts into perspective the amount of carbon dioxide released from that. Rather than Scope 1 and Scope 2 costs, obviously science doesn't just exist as an ecosystem within itself, but has to require getting new equipment and facilities from across the world. So if you look at the life cycle map, I'm pointing out 4 nodes at which I have to buy stuff from other people, whether it be the vials that the flies are stored in, whether it be the flies themselves, chemical reagents, and some optical equipment. For the purposes of time, I'm just going to focus on the first 2. So if you look at vials, what we did was we contacted procurers to see where the vials came from and made some best estimates about how those vials got from Mexico in this instance to us as we purchased them. It's worth pointing out that at this point, I might know the origin of this, but the precise means of transport are things that are often hidden behind things like proprietary information, as in companies are quite reticent about giving you this information for reasons of taxation and stuff that I can't understand. Nevertheless, looking at min-max estimations, if you use the most lowest form of carbon dioxide transmission, which is a massive cargo ship that goes from the factory in Mexico to the main port in Mexico, all the way to Plymouth and then up, you'd end up producing around 0.07 kilograms per 500 vials. If instead you flew, for whatever reason, that would produce around 10 kilograms. It's based on the amount of vials, which was 8,500 that our lab used every year. This produces a massive range, but at least some range between 2 and 156 kilograms of carbon dioxide based just on buying vials. Looked at fly stocks. So we don't obviously just make flies out of nowhere. We buy them from a central facility in Indiana in America. Given the time-sensitive nature of these flies, they die. We don't use probably slower modes of transport. We use quicker modes of transport, so we can make more refined estimations. Per vial, this probably releases around 7 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent. Based on the amount of flies I bought from Bloomington's last year, this is upwards of 300 kilograms of carbon dioxide. All of these numbers are great, hopefully. This puts into perspective that procurement is around 10% of experimental emissions related costs. So you have some interesting proportions. So all of these are, a lot of numbers. I think the take home here is not the number, but the fact that you can do this yourself, recognizing how much carbon dioxide you are producing in your research. And indeed, you can actually publish it as we are about to do, and also hopefully find ways to mitigate it. If we think about moving into the future, though, we already know there is decarbonization efforts happening, particularly within the UK electricity grid. So if we look at the bottom, these are projections based on the trends of data reported by the national grid as well as the UK government. If we did nothing, as in if we just continue the trends we're already doing, we'd achieve net carbon neutrality by 2050, which is significantly further away than the target, which is 2030. 2030 not just being the target that is held by international standards, but probably the most realistic target we need to reach in order to, not enter catastrophic climate change. As you can see, we're currently not on track to do this, which means we need different types of interventions like ex-ante mitigation. Especially, even if we want to bolster the cynical arguments, Scotland, at least where we are, will not be net neutral in terms of its carbon electricity grid by 2030. Other regions of the UK will. As funding bodies become more alert to this idea, we are now on the back foot insofar as we were on the front foot initially in terms of carbon preference. We won't be in 2030. So ex-ante mitigation probably is essential. So that's a lot of data. The actual bits I wanted you to take away are now at the end of this presentation. So what I want to show you now is how we did the calculations and how we are using our funding that we got from the Scotland Future series to help the school and other people do this as well. So what we did is you take these really cheap power meters you get from Amazon, you stick it in the wall between obviously that and the equipment, and you record the amount of kilowatt hour usage of your experiments per hour. You then take these numbers and you use free APIs that are produced by the national grid to give you time and region specific carbon dioxide estimations based on the amount of kilowatt hours you're using. And you use conversion data, particularly from the government, as well as ICAO, which uses travel, is quite a reliable travel cost estimator. This is how we did it. This is obviously a time-intensive process, as in a lot of Excel spreadsheets, a lot of Python code. But in order to make it easier for everybody else, we put this into a free app for everybody. So we called it WillCO2st, i.e. what will my research cost? Good pun. So we are currently testing this at the moment, but it does work. So what you do is you have you use your power meter to look at what the kilowatt hour is of your particular experiment. This may be an EEG machine. This may be some virtual reality machine. You know how much it costs per hour, and you log how many times you use it, when you use it, and for how long you use it. This will give you region and time-specific estimations. These are more accurate than other carbon calculators you may get that just use averages. You can also estimate travel costs as well. So the app allows you to track as you're moving on a particular vehicle in order to give you an accurate and realistic carbon estimation based on UK conversion factor studies, and it's reported, so we update it every year. There's also direct release, as I showed you earlier with our virgin collecting. I know how much carbon is released per vial, indeed, as well as the unit of time, and I can therefore time myself as I do this to provide a consistent estimate. And all of this produces data in a CSV document that you can export for your pleasure. All of this is something that we are encouraging people to do, to contribute to something called the Codex. So this is now where it gets nice and interesting. So the idea behind this project is not just to have a lot of data, but to allow doctoral students, or in some ways instrumentalize them, into creating loads of carbon information in forms of carbon appendices. So what we envisage is at the end of a PhD, there will be at least some estimations that their PhD student has made on the carbon intensity of their research, whether it be an experiment, whether it be a set of practical experiments they've used, that are then published for other individuals to use. Over time, other researchers that maybe had less time or wanted to scrutinize the information are able, just like in the common scientific methods, to have access to this information to inform not just their experiments, but to better plan less carbon intensive experiments. Over time, then, these appendices will be aggregated together to form a codex of appendices that will be massively utilized by both industry, governments, and other scientists in order to better inform and scrutinize policies. I.e., if you know the ways in which this scientists can and cannot ex-ante mitigate, you're better able to understand what the barriers are, and therefore governments are better able to understand where the barriers are and therefore to get rid of them. Similarly, with information like procurement, you activate the classic market incentives of industries to be more aware that scientists are actually now aware of their carbon intensities of their products and can start the race to the bottom in terms of carbon neutrality. As in, if you have 3 companies that are producing the same product and individuals are now aware that they want less carbon intensive products, this activates the classic market incentives for companies to want to produce and sustain lower and lower intensity research procurement. Another way of conceptualizing this is by the model of ecological succession. So the way we envisage this working, hopefully, if people get on board, which I hope we will be, which is you start with a pioneering stage. So these are where you have a subdiscipline where you don't know how much carbon is being produced by anything. So you don't know how much the experiments are likely producing, your common recruitment, like an electrode, whatever. But therefore, you start with PhD students that at least make some estimations, as in the form of carbon appendices. Eventually, intermediate succession forms. Multiple PhD students are doing this. They're starting to scrutinize industry, as our lab are doing. This therefore starts to form an ecosystem of this information. And eventually, all daisies and wonderful stuff, everyone has contributed some degree of an appendices, and eventually you have a codex of information. That means you have a lot of not just information, but successive generations of scientists that are not just very good scientists, but also incredibly carbon literate about the ways they're producing their research, such that you don't just have to rely on top-down types of change, but you can also rely on bottom-up type of change. Cool. So returning to the thesis of the presentation, hopefully, if you had this first critique, the idea that actually these things are already happening, even if they're already happening, they can happen quicker. There are direct changes that we have done. So changing the type of equipment, changing when I do experiments, changing how much procurement I have. In terms of this year, I'm going to probably produce 30% less carbon dioxide as a result of just doing this research, which in terms of that, I mean, it's like hot showers is maybe not the best take-home message, but it is significantly less than I would have done if I had not done this research. And the second is, oh, this is carbon, and this is very time-intensive, William. I don't have time to do this. You do, because this app makes it significantly easier for you to do this. And indeed, if you're going to speak cynically, it can actually make your career far more successful in terms of the fact you differentiate yourself from other people who aren't doing it, and you get publications for it, which is good. The last thing to say is we received the Scotland Future series funded a series of workshops that we'll be running next semester, where we teach people how to do this. If you're interested in learning how to do it, there is a free workshop that will be run probably here and online. Feel free to scan the QR code. That being said, though, I'd like to thank people who helped me do this research. So there are these people in the nice picture here. So this is Amy, Rangini, and Stefan. Some of the partners that helped us provide the procurement information. So this is like Lucy from SLS. Joseph, who's a policy person that we'll be working with next semester, some of the estate staff that provided us information about the electricity grids and the local electricity production, Ken, who provided some estimations about how we got that information, as well as people from Bloomington, and the funders who provided this basis to do this research. Cool.